We are back with former New Jersey governor, former presidential candidate, and former Trump transition chair, the very current Chris Christie. He's out today with his new memoir entitled Let Me Finish, Trump, the Kushners, Bannon, Jersey, and the Power of In-Your-Face Politics. Want to hear about the bad blood in the White House. Willie, take it away. Or Mike, you go first.
Well, Willie, he's the bad blood guy. In the book, you write about Donald Trump. He has a keen understanding of what regular people are feeling. Are you kidding? Do you really believe that?
No, listen. I absolutely believe that he does from watching him interact with people when we were campaigning together. And I didn't think he would. Let me start off by saying, like, I never campaigned with him before. So after I endorsed him, this is the primary in 16, we would work rope lines together. And the way he interacted with people and the way they reacted to him was a surprise.
Okay, well, we saw that too. Yeah. But he's governing like a plutocrat.
The context of that was talking about him as a political candidate. And as a political candidate, he understood how to relate to people and how they took him back. So that's the context of that quote, Mike.
That was then. Right? This is now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, he's clearly didn't understand it in the 35 days of the shutdown.
Okay, so earlier we were talking about this great gift that we've all been given. It's called America.
Right.
And yet nearly every day in his presidency that I can recall, he does something to provoke or divide specific peoples from other peoples in this country. So let me ask you this. You've spent a lot of time doing this book, thinking about him, the campaign, and the administration. Is there anything, I asked Cliff Sims this earlier, is there anything about his presidency that scares you?
Oh, well, listen, I think I put this in the book at great length. The people that he has selected in large part to be around him has really disturbed me. And I name names in the book. I mean, I think Michael Flynn. I mean, I think it's one of the biggest reasons I got fired.
What about Stephen Miller, a guy that said he doesn't want another refugee to touch American soil?
You know, listen, Stephen and I have to tell you the truth, on a personal level, always got along. Right. We don't agree on a whole bunch of things, but on a personal level, I always got along with Stephen. But I would say guys like Bannon in the White House.
What about Whitaker?
Well, listen, Matt and I served as U.S. attorneys together, and I think Matt has been put, and has allowed himself to be put, in a really untenable situation. And by the way, and I've said this to others, this fault goes back to the selection of Jeff Sessions and the way Jeff Sessions ran that Justice Department. I mean, I've never seen the Justice Department more demoralized in the time that I've known it.
But you certainly agree that Jeff Sessions needed to recuse himself, right?
Listen. That's a personal decision Jeff made, but I will tell you...
You would have made the same decision.
I would not have made the same decision.
If you had lied to Congress about meetings with Russians...
But that's
if you had lied to Russia about meetings with the Russians, and then you had to decide whether to recuse yourself, you would recuse yourself.
Well, of course, first of all, I would never lied, but you make a great point. That's not why he said he recused. He said he recused because he was involved in the campaign. Now, he knew that in November. He didn't just remember in March, oh, heck, I was involved in the campaign. If he had been honest and said, I'm recusing because I testified incorrectly, untruthfully before Congress, that's one thing. Not what he said, Joe. And that's how the president got shafted here. Because if Jeff Sessions thought it was a conflict to be involved with the campaign to be Attorney General, that he should have told Donald Trump that in November when he asked to be Attorney General. So from that moment, he was messing up the Justice Department, and it never recovered.
But it wasn't like he had a DeLorean and he could go back in time. He didn't know how things were going to unfold in November and December and January.
But he knew he was involved in the campaign. If his excuse
he didn't know
was
that he was going to have to make that decision. He didn't know that the investigation was going to take off the way it did.
But the investigation already existed, and the investigation into Russian collusion and Russian interference with the campaign.
It had not taken off.
No, but it had already begun, and he knew that, and we all knew that publicly. We were talking about it then. But I don't want to get sidetracked on this. But what I want to say to you is, I agree with you that the real reason he recused, not the reason he stated, but the real reason he recused was because he got caught giving untrue testimony to Congress, and when the heat got turned on, he ran. And he left Rod Rosenstein, who I know well and have great respect for, and we served as U.S. attorneys together in the Bush administration. He left Rod holding the bag. He left Rod holding the bag. That's not leadership. Okay. If you were gonna recuse for that basis and you didn't tell the Congress the truth, you should have resigned.
I don't want to spend too much.
Not recused.
I don't want to spend too much.
Different
time on
R
this because
word.
we have so much.
I know.
But he recused on the second. I think Comey revealed the investigation of March 20th, like a couple of weeks later. So, so then let's put the question to you this way. Then, what worries you the most about Donald Trump being president over the next 2 years? Is it Russia and this bizarre relationship he has with Putin? Is it that he has chased off a pretty extraordinary Secretary of Defense? Is it that he has ceded Syria to the Iranians and to the Russians? What scares you the most about Donald Trump being president over the next 2 years?
What scares me the most about the next 2 years is the very real possibility that no one will get anything done in any of those areas or any of the domestic areas that we need to get done because we're so divided governmentally now.
You dealt with Democrats in Jersey.
I did.
Why can't Donald Trump, the Donald Trump we've all known, and we were talking about it, the Donald Trump who contributed money to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Rahm Emanuel and the DNC and spent his life as a Democrat.
Right.
Why can't this guy sit down with Democrats and say, okay, listen, my people are going to stay with me no matter what I do. Let's figure out an immigration fix. Let's figure out a transportation fix. Let's figure out how to get some points up on the board.
Well, let me tell you.
Why can't he do that?
I think he's going to have to decide if he wants to run for re-election and win. That's what he's going to have to do. And he's going to have big decisions to make in the next 2 years about that. Big decisions to make. And if he doesn't make the right decisions, then he's going to have much more difficulty. And I will tell you this. The transition plan that we laid out that I talk about in the book would have taken him in a much different direction than these first 6 chaotic months did.
But Jared stabbed you in the back there. Jared stabbed you in the back for AG. Jared stabbed you in the back as far as being vice president. I mean, why are you still hanging out with these people?
Well, wait a second. I'm hanging out.
This is what
This is a good
Mitch
question.
McConnell says. What is it? You don't get much of a lesson
really
from
want to have it
the
both
second
ways?
kick of the mule. The mule's kicked you 3 times now, Chris. Maybe it's time to take up something else.
No, but here's the point. The point is that I love this country enough that I'm not willing to give in and not have influence when you can make sure that somebody like Chris Wray becomes director of the FBI. Is our country and is the Justice Department a better place because Chris Wray's at the FBI? Okay. I believe damn right it is, Joe. So I don't give in. You know me. I don't give in. People can stab me, kick me, punch me. I get up.
Okay. I just want to say, Willie, this is a very interesting debate. There are a lot of people out there that'll be pissed off by what Chris just said. And Meek and I heard time and again from people we respected the most in government, whether it was Robert Gates, one of the greats, I think, or General Hayden. So many people said we only have one president, and we got to do everything we can do to try to help that president. So that goes along with Chris's argument. Yep. You don't have to agree with it.
I guess, but this is we're in
Mika doesn't
different
agree
time.
with it, but it is.
I don't.
That is a very.
I think at some point you gotta.
It's an interesting dilemma. Well, yeah, and
pick a side.
At some point.
Well, that's what elections are about too, right?
That's true.
Okay.
Really,
and that's the argument we heard from General Kelly and others why they hung in there. The Kushner name is on the front of the book right here, right in the subhead. Jared Kushner, that exchange we talked about Russia, said the firing of Mike Flynn, that ends the Russia thing. Fast forward now to the shutdown. He was giving advice, Jared Kushner, reportedly to the president, dig in, hang in, we're going to win this fight. They didn't win the fight. They got nothing out of it except sagging poll numbers. So I just put the question to you, why does President Trump continue to listen to Jared Kushner as his de facto chief of staff when the advice time and again has frankly been terrible?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to me. And I listen, I just say this to you. Like, this is part of the issue of having family work for you. Yeah. Right? I mean, I've always said, like, I never wanted any members of my family working for me because if I had to fire him, I'd have to also sit with him at Thanksgiving. And that's a really uncomfortable thing. So to me, I think, and I told the president this, I said, I put aside whatever talents you believe and can be objectively proven that any one of the members of your family have. It is an untenable situation to be trying to manage. So, for instance, I sat with him 5-6 weeks ago and talked about the chief of staff's job. And one of the things I said was, like, anybody who takes this job should not have Jared or Ivanka report to them, because it's folly to think that they would. They report to you. They're your responsibility. And if a chief of staff wants to be successful in this job, then that's the way that reporting has to be. I think we need to be realistic about this. And so I can't answer that question, Willie, because I don't know.
So Jared gives the worst advice. The president takes it. These are two spots, Jared and Ivanka, that could be filled with competent people who could stand up to him and give him good advice. I mean, this is
or not filled at all. I mean, you know, but listen, at the end of it, what this creates, though, is a difficult situation, which is what I try to describe in the book. That I had 140 people working for me at the transition. Mm-hmm. They worked 6 months to put together an extraordinary transition plan. And in fact, when both plans were looked at right before the election, you had objective people saying that our plan was even ahead of where Hillary and her plan and her team was. Mm-hmm. We put together this extraordinary thing, and because a couple of people decide they want to be in charge, Jared, Steve Bannon, and Rick Dearborn, they throw all that work out. And what I say in the book is the country's still paying the price for that, because you cannot put this thing together in 71 days, especially when you've never been in government before.
Yeah.
Right? So all those decisions come back to inure to the detriment of the president, and they come back to inure, more importantly, to the detriment of the country. Because we still have desks empty in places, and things that should be filled and being done aren't being done.
You could have the greatest staff in the world. You could have followed your transition plan to the T, and still you're left with someone, and we hear this repeatedly, and you hear it repeatedly. Elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, who go to the Oval Office to talk to the president about specific things, they come back and they say, he had no idea what I was talking about. He had not read what was prepared for him. He had no really solid, smart questions to ask. What do we do about that?
Well, the best way to deal with anybody's shortcomings, is to put better choices in front of them to make. And the thing that the thing that a good staff does, Mike, and you know this, the thing that good staff does is put good choices in front of a decision maker so that any one of the choices will wind up being okay. What happened in this instance was, you know, let's use one example of one cabinet position. Our top recommendation for HHS was Alex Azar. Now, we wound up with Tom Price, which was an unmitigated disaster. If he had met Azar, I believe he would have picked Azar in November, December of 2016, because when he finally did meet Azar afterwards, he did pick him. So part of what you need to do, especially with someone who hasn't been involved in government before, is to put good choices in front of them so that whatever choice they do make, they're going to wind up being in a range of talent that they have around that can run those things.
There's so many questions at the top of every department. I mean, DHS, Willie. I mean, the separations, let's just not even start with that. The way they handled it, the head of the DHS doesn't seem qualified at all.
How about EPA? We could throw Scott.
Well, and by the way, I talk about that in the book as well. I talk about EPA, and let me say this on DHS. They deserve some of the blame. But you know who instituted the separation plan. It was Jeff Sessions. It was Jeff Sessions who spoke up at a cabinet meeting and said, I can fix this for you, Mr. President. If we tell them they got to be separated from their children when they come in, they won't come.
So why is that immoral policy still?
What's
still
going on?
Not unwound?
And we find out it's worse and worse, and there's more children than we even know.
It's not.
It's not what?
You said, how is that a moral policy?
No,
it's not.
I'm asking, how is that immoral policy still haunting us?
Yes.
How have we not unwound it? Why haven't we sent government officials down there to take care of those kids?
Because you know what happens in these situations then. Once the bureaucracy gets wound into doing one thing, unwinding it takes a long time. And that's why the initial decision is so flawed. because to turn that back around without having the resources you need down there, either with the right number of judges and the right number of lawyers to represent people and give them due process, that's why it was a disastrous recommendation.
Which was
it's just wrong,
executed
Joe.
And pushed by the president,
well,
and then fronted by the head of the DHS.
But Mika, let's be fair about this, okay? If you're sitting around and you're Donald Trump and you're not a lawyer, and your attorney general says to you, we can do this and we can do it the right way and no one will be harmed, which is the way it was presented to him. Okay? He then says, okay, go ahead and do it.
Chris, if you were governor of New Jersey and somebody suggested something like that, you would say, get out. If you were president of the United States,
and by the way,
you would say, get out.
And my level of sophistication on that issue is greater than his. No doubt about it. And that's one of the problems where, with him not being a lawyer and not understanding that kind of process, he got talked into it by the Attorney General of the United States, who pursued his own personal agenda on immigration rather than what was supposed to be the right policy for the country and those people.
I don't know how much legal sophistication you need to know separating kids from their parents is wrong, but that's a different question. I want to ask, because this book is also about your political career, so I want to ask you a quick one before we go.
All right.
8 years ago at this time, run up to the 2012 presidential campaign, there were few hotter politicians in America than Governor Christie in New Jersey. As you look back now...
Do you still have the Time magazine cover frame?
Yeah, that was after 12. That's okay.
Wow. As you look back now, do you regret not running for president in 2012 when that may have been your time?
No, I had a quaint, which is now seems an antiquated view that you had to be ready to be president. Right. And I felt like I'd been governor for 15 months, and Joe knows I had these conversations with him at that time. Yeah. Like I just felt like I have no business running for president of the United States after being governor of New Jersey for 15 months. I'm not ready. And I understood the political moment, and I understood that I probably had a pretty good chance to certainly win the nomination, and then who knows what would have happened against Barack Obama. You know, probably it's a jump ball. But I made the decision that I needed in my heart to believe that I was ready, mature enough, prepared enough to take on the most important job in the world. And so I have no regrets.
But in this new context, you know, maybe you should have.
Well, let me go say this. In this new context, after we have 8 years of a president whose main accomplishment politically was to be a state senator, and I dealt with a lot of state senators, no offense. None of the ones that I met should be president of the United States. And now a president who had no political experience of any kind at all. Right. You know, that's why I say my decision looks antiquated, but it doesn't change who I am, Willie. I would not have done it. I still would not go back and change it. And I think that what happened to me in 2016 and the run-up to that, and I write this in the book, and we spent a couple of chapters on it, was I had 3 low-level aides who decided to do something extraordinarily stupid without my knowledge, without my permission, without my consent, and it turned the entire thing on its head. And I think it encouraged people like Jeb Bush and Donald Trump to get into a race that they might otherwise not have gotten into, given my standing at the end of 2013 and into 14, having gotten 51% of the Hispanic vote.
Donald Trump always said, by the way, privately, always said that you were guilty, that you were lying about the bridge.
He said it publicly, as I detail in the book. You will particularly like that section when you get to the highlighted part of that, because I deconstruct his speech he made in December accusing me of knowing something about Bridgegate. Line by line, we deconstruct it and then tell the story that when I went after him that night, after he went after me in the afternoon, we got a call the next day from Corey Lewandowski saying, he doesn't want Chris coming after him, we want a truce. And I said, well, if he wants a truce, he can call me directly and ask me for one. And he did, and said, I was wrong, I shouldn't have said it, I know it's not true, and you'll never hear me say it again. And he never again said it publicly. So, but that also tells you a little bit, Joe, like about my personality and about how you have to deal with people sometimes. Deal head on and be direct. And when he said all those untrue things about me, no matter the fact that I'd known him for 14 years, I took him right on in public that
By
night.
the way, that's a great message to Democrats as they move towards 2020. If you're going to beat Donald Trump, you're going to beat Donald Trump by taking him head on just like that.
And I think it's any politician, Joe. You know, if you want to win, go out and play to win. And I'd say that to anybody who's going to run for president at any time. Because I have no second thoughts about 2016. The way I ran my race, I'm proud of what we did. I'm proud of how I conducted myself. And you know, my only regret is I didn't win. But you know what? You guys know this because you were in the middle of it. That was a phenomenon in the Republican side of things that none of us were going to be able to contend with, and there were a whole bunch of factors that we could sit down over 8 drinks one night to dissect.
By the way, it was it was
like a very sad night.
It was just like 2008. It was like Barack Obama. We would see the Democratic debates, and everybody would talk about Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and who won, when we were all sitting around the table going, wait a second, Chris Dodd and Joe Biden were easily the best debaters on the stage that night. But those guys, nobody was paying attention to them because the big story was Hillary versus Barack and history being made.
Well, and then the night in New Hampshire, when I had my debate back and forth with Marco Rubio, I don't think in every one of the debates I was in, I was rated as one of the top 2 or 3 debaters and knew what I was talking about and was prepared to be president. That's not what people wanted to hear. I'll tell you one quick anecdote. Mary Pat went door to door in New Hampshire a lot, and she learned a lot, and she came, and this is when I knew we were in big trouble. She said she went to a door one day and said to I'm Mary Pat Christie, I'm married to the governor. The woman says, oh, God, we love your husband. He's so smart and articulate and direct. I mean, we're voting for Trump, but we love your husband. He's just a great guy. Mary Pat says, well, wait a second. If you love Chris and he's so direct, and why are you voting for Trump? She goes, yeah, because your husband's a politician. We don't need a politician. We need somebody. We need a businessman.
Yep, that was.
And I said to Mary Pat, like, we can't get by that.
No.
16 was a year where if you had a title in front of your name, it was a killer.
Yeah.
And I think people look back on it now, maybe feel differently. But at the time, that's what we were contending with.
They may actually want in 2020 a brain surgeon who's actually had.
Are you endorsing Dr. Ben?
No.
Is that a Dr. Ben endorsement?
No.
Mika, let me finish.
Through a lot. No, let me finish. Former Governor Chris Christie, it's always good to see you. Congratulations
happy to
on
be
the
here.
book.
Thank you, Governor.
The
Thanks for
book
having me.
is Let Me Finish. Trump, the Kushners, Bannon, Jersey, and the power of in-your-face politics. It's out today. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Governor.
I'm happy to be here.
Don't know how you do it. Still ahead, the Congressional Budget Office says the government shutdown cost the economy $11 billion, but the White House is pushing back at that price tag. And the State of the Union is back on. President Trump will give the address next week, even as another partial government shutdown looms. We'll have much more Morning Joe ahead. We're back in 3 minutes.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.